You've written an op-ed in the New York Times, and you're arguing that this war between the US and Iran risks becoming a forever war. And you say that is the logic of a forever war. Each side uses violence to test the other's endurance. War becomes negotiation by other means. And we know that both sides, frankly, Ali, have been doubling down. And it is about who is willing to endure the most pain. So help us understand why you think we're on the path to a forever war.
It's great to be with you. Look, the logic is very simple. It took about 2 months to negotiate a page and a half of the Memorandum of Understanding between April 8th, which was a ceasefire between Iran and the US, to June 18th, when the memorandum was finalized. It took only 3 weeks for it to unravel. And the point I'm making is, if such a minimal understanding cannot hold between the two sides, basically there's no way you can put a floor under these tensions between Iran and the United States, which means that we are going to go from one cycle of violence into the next. And this is exactly the concept of a forever war. If you can't resolve issues, if you can't even scratch the surface, end the war on which both sides agreed, reopen the strait again on which the general concept both sides agreed, and you don't have deconfliction mechanisms, that if you have disagreements over interpretation of an understanding, then you are basically locked in an escalatory cycle of violence.
Yeah, it's the escalation trap, and that's sort of the danger. A promise of just lasting a few weeks, we're months in now. But you have talked about a potential off-ramp when it comes to the issue of managing traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. That is Iran's main point of leverage. I want you to take me through what that might actually look like.
So look, the dispute right now is that the text of the MOU, in a very imprecise way, talked about the fact that over the 30 days of implementation of the agreement, Iran would be responsible to making its best efforts to reopen the strait and return traffic to where it was before the war. In the first week of the implementation of the MOU, almost 50% of the traffic was restored. But then the US opened the southern corridor much closer to Oman's territorial waters. Iran saw this as US effort to erode its leverage and started shooting at vessels, and we are in another round of conflict now. So basically the solution would be that there would be a joint coordination center in which Iran and the Gulf cooperation countries could have a monitoring mechanism of what traffic is coming in and going out of the strait, so that both sides of the Gulf are involved, and that we return to the MOU. That's the only solution, because again, if the floor collapses, then there's no foundation on which you can build anything. And by the way, let me add that this is cognizant of the fact that there's also no military solution to reopening the strait. The US can bomb Iran for another 6 weeks, and Iran will still be able to fly drones and missiles into the strait.
Yeah, that's a really interesting prospect. I mean, we've heard about a joint coordination sort of mechanism between Iran and Oman. There was apparently a hotline that was going to be created with the United States. But it seems Iran is just saying, you know, you've got to use the northern corridor, and showing that it can inflict pain towards the southern corridor. And it just talks about who's really got superiority here. That's about bringing Iran to the table, isn't it?
Well, it is about control. You're absolutely right. But this is why a joint coordination center doesn't necessarily deprive Iran of knowing what's coming in and what's going out. The problem Iranians had was that they had no visibility in the southern corridor, and therefore they saw it as means of eroding their leverage. If they believe that they still have the leverage, and by the way, if the US delivers on the positive incentives that were promised in the deal, and on that front, there were serious shortcomings, whether it was release of Iran's frozen assets, or basically allowing Iran to sell oil and petrochemical products and repatriate the revenue. If these things are on the table and concretely delivered, then I think Iran would have less of an incentive to try to use the strait as a revenue generation mechanism.
Yeah, and look, while we're talking, the maritime industry is infuriated with what's going on. They want to get vessels out. The risks are obviously very serious. And now you've got threats around closing Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well. Give me a sense of how President Trump keeps Gulf allies on side, even as he continues to fight this war of his own choosing and in their backyard.
Look, the Gulf states didn't want this war to start and don't want Iran to be in control of the Strait. So if you don't want a military solution and you don't want Iran's dominance, there is only one solution, which is a win-win diplomatic solution. And some of the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, that was part of this mediating group, and Qatar, which did a lot of heavy lifting to make the memorandum of understanding happen, are exactly on board with that kind of vision. The problem, again, is that instead of returning to the negotiating table to resolve differences over the interpretation of the text, the two sides decided to use force to enforce their own interpretation. And that's why, again, I think these mediating countries, the Gulf countries, can come back in and offer new ideas and new solutions to prevent a bad situation from getting worse, because you're absolutely right. All of these tensions that we've had or have been primarily about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. If you have a second critical choke point, Bab el-Mandeb, added to that, I think we would have a major energy shock and potentially a global recession as a result.
Nikki Nickback recently learned that her two brothers, Hadi and Fazlullah, have been given the death sentence by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Every day from her home in Germany, she checks in with her family back home. Nikki's brothers are just two of dozens of political prisoners facing execution in Iran right now. They stand accused of encouraging dissent against the regime and were convicted of broad charges of corruption. The Islamic Republic in the past has said that they only issued the death penalty after due process and that it's only given for very serious crimes, for people who have committed horrendous things. Is that not what your brothers have done?
همیشه سعی میکنن افرادی که سیاسی هستن رو از حکمای خطرناک مثلا بگن نه خطرناک بودن برای جامعه و حکم اعدام براشون دادن. در واقع یک نوع ترس داره تو جامعه ایجاد میکنه.
Earlier this year, after widespread protests where the authorities cracked down with lethal force, President Trump claimed he'd stepped in to stop Iran from executing hundreds of people. But since the US-led war, Iran has intensified repression and sped up the pace of executions. At least 44 political prisoners, including protesters, have been killed since the conflict broke out, according to the Norway-based Iran Human Rights NGO. So this is Hadi and his wife and his two sons, and how are they handling it?
فکر کنم مادرشون اصلا بهشون نگفته حکم اعدام برای باباشون اومده.
With each execution, the regime sends a chilling message. We're still in charge, and dissent will not be tolerated. It must be impossible to put out of your mind. I mean, how are you feeling on a daily basis about what could be to come?
من الان فقط میدونم که تنها کاری که میتونم بکنم صداشون باشم. هیچ کار دیگه نمیتونم بکنم. نمیدونم چیش بگم، واقعا شرایط خیلی سنگینه، ولی خب به هر حال باید قوی باشیم. در نهایت چاره‌ای جز قوی بودن نداریم ما.
Human rights groups decry what they say are forced confessions used to justify these executions. Earlier this year, 26-year-old Nasser Bakaderzer and 28-year-old Mehrab Abdullahzadeh confessed to serious crimes. Nasser's filmed confession about espionage was used as propaganda and publicized on Iranian state media. But in recorded calls from prison during their final days, both Nasser and Mehrab said they'd been tortured into making these confessions.
از روز اول دستگیری به زور شکنجه و تهدید از من اعترافاتی گرفتن که همشون کیز بود و هیچ کدام از اتهام‌هایی که اونا به من زدن حقیقت نداره.
Both Nasser and Mehrab were hanged on the 2nd of May. Hamid Chapati shared a cell with both men in Urumia Central Prison. Chapati is a Kurdish Iranian activist who was imprisoned there for 3 months.
برای ناصر و مهراب و هر محکوم به اعدامی هر روز آخره. هر لحظهشون لحظه آخره. شبا نمیتونن بخوابن.
Do you remember the day when you found out that Nasser was executed?
ناصر وقتی حکم اعدامش تایید شد از طریق یه دوست مشترکمون برام پیغام فرستاده بود که من برای آخرین بار میخوام باش حرف بزنم و متاسفانه من نتونستم باش حرف بزنم. ولی خب خبر اعدامشون رو شنیدم واقعا منم باشون اعدام شدم.
As the war in Iran heats up again, human rights feel far from the priority, and the regime is once again ruling through fear. Isabel Young, CNN, London.